University in biology and mathematics. A very cool and interesting combination. He also tells me that he's a keen photographer and that all the images on your slides are taken by you. Is that correct? Great. So, Brian, take it away.
Okay. I'll try to stay close to the mic here. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Brian Schatteman. I'm a U2 Bachelor of Science student at McGill University. I joined major in math and bio, specifically theoretical ecology and theoretical math. So today will be mostly about theory, so I hope you guys can stay with me. There's not going to be a lot of engaging graphs, but there's pictures, so I hope that helps. I'm also a facilitator at the ECOLE project, which is a sustainability hub on campus. So I'll talk more about them and the other groups that helped me get here towards the end. So as an overview of today's presentation, first we'll be discussing forest ecosystem services, defining the typically productive paradigm that forests are defined by, as well as identifying human-forest interactions and the principle of ecosystem services. We'll move on to the climate change response of these ecosystems, predicting threats and suggestions for mitigating nuisance species proliferation. And we'll talk about feedbacks of this ecosystem into the global atmosphere. Next, we'll discuss biodiversity in forest ecosystems, including the natural drivers of plant diversity, the perhaps underappreciated role of facilitation. We'll assess current urban biodiversity and provide motivation and means of conservation efforts in the city. Lastly, we'll incorporate all this into urban forest management strategies, utilizing principles from restoration ecology to suggest specific things for sourcing, planting, and research required, ultimately arriving at the concept of guided succession. So, the forest classification scheme, there's rural and urban forests. The rural pictured here is Algonquin Park. The urban here is Parc La Fontaine in Montreal. So the rural forest has been traditionally defined by function, species trait, landscape type. Comes out of this productive mindset. We're mainly focusing on how it can be used in a human sense for timber products and things. The urban forest includes more forms of vegetation at lower densities throughout the urban matrix. And it comes from this paradigm, or the management of it can come from this paradigm of consumption or recreation. It's something to be enjoyed and not necessarily used. Principal ecosystem services or all ecosystem services are anthropogenically defined. The types of services include provisioning, regulating, cultural, supporting, and environmental/industrial. The two types of forests can benefit from the paradigm of the other, though, as we're seeing. So there's more examples of urban forests being thought of in a productive mindset and rural being thought of in a recreational mindset. Given all these ecosystem services, there are many that directly affect human health, including air pollution reduction, public orchards, community gardens, hydrological control of disease vectors, which is often understudied. We talk about the hydrology in a physical sense, but it also affects the ability of pathogens to persist. With that, water pollution reduction. Green inequity therefore describes the inequitable distribution of accessible green spaces based on socioeconomic gradients that we can see cropping up in other things, such as proximity to food sources. This is most prominent in urban environments, this lack of comparable green infrastructure, and it exacerbates other public health issues. Solutions to this issue include supporting legacy tree programs, protecting old trees, receiving community input in urban forest management, and leveraging the financial impact of the urban forest to make money for the local community or for the managing body. Okay. With that, we want to protect these ecosystems from threats related to climate change. So we've discussed principal statistics of climate change already, and people here previously have discussed, to more accurately, the expected rise in temperature and precipitation in some areas, decreased precipitation in other areas. It's a regional effect, and interestingly, we'll talk about how it's evolutionarily. Some regions are more adapted to certain changes than others. These changes will have several direct and indirect effects on the trees of both forests, compounded by evolutionary factors that determine the ultimate community assemblages of the future. Direct effects on dominant trees include an extension of the growing season. This is a phenological offset, or an offset to the natural timing of the organisms. Direct host stress and mechanical damage, as we've seen throughout Charlottetown, but also in other areas after large storms. This was after a storm that hit central Illinois. Indirectly, climate change conditions will allow pests to proliferate. This is a type of worm that grows in certain trees, and once they attach to one tree, you have to completely kill it and remove like any traces of it. This is from Pennsylvania. Climate change will also result in fewer cold threshold days, allowing increased pests and pathogens to persist, which might naturally be killed off by cold winters. Evolutionary factors that compound our prediction of these things in the future include host pest generation times. Hosts usually have larger generation times and therefore may adapt more slowly to changing climates. Natural genotypic and phenotypic plasticity describe the adaptive power of different species, where natural high genetic diversity might lead to quicker adaptation. Climate change has induced hybridizations, which is an interesting phenomenon where we think that species of similar, or the same genus, but different species can be threatened to a different degree, and it'll induce hybridization between organisms of the same genus, because that's possible in many cases. There's also positive interspecific interactions to consider, like mutualisms, pollination, and lastly, trophic cascades. So, in addition to direct climate change effects, there's also the proliferation of invasive species that happens not as a direct result of climate change, but just human actions. Proximity to human interactions is unfortunately a good metric for the potential of the ecosystem to be invaded, but there's also structural drivers like the leaf litter, diameter, height, and canopy cover of dominant trees. And tree dominance overall serves as the best indicator of invasion potential, with high tree dominance being associated with low invasion potential. This demonstrates what's called the large tree filtering function, where large trees determine the community assemblages of things outside the community. Controlling the understory microclimate without being part of the understory is a really interesting power that large trees have that is not as present with smaller trees, even if they're the same species. To mitigate nuisance species proliferation, there are several strategies, and also research required, so things like cold hardiness assessments can validate a species' ability to disperse with changing temperature envelopes. Estimating genotypic plasticity, phenotypic plasticity are both useful to determine how quickly something can evolve over time. The genetic studies are sometimes compounded by the fact that gymnosperms have these long repeating segments of DNA, so it can be difficult to fully sequence or to figure out what natural variation in that will lead to adaptive power. What's also important if you're trying to avoid nuisance species mitigation is monitoring gaps in the canopy, as this serves as like a marker of invasive potential or the action of increased tree mortality. So the overall response of the forest ecosystem to climate change will itself induce a feedback on the global atmosphere, just given the size of the ecosystem. Focusing on just the boreal alone, there are plenty of important feedbacks related to carbon sequestration. So it contains in above and below ground stores 30% of terrestrial bound carbon. These northern latitudes are expected to see the greatest temperature increase as well, which is unfortunate, given that the boreal alone constitutes half of the large intact forest left in the world. With a large portion being in Canada, and an increasingly important portion being in Canada due to increased fragmentation in Russia, which is the country with the other highest percentage. So natural drivers of forest dynamics of productivity include growth, mortality, and recruitment. Climate forcings affecting these natural drivers include understory light and temperature enrichment, and composition changes caused by changing climates. Certain things that can happen would be like one species swapping out for another that are comparable, but also a general trend from coniferous to deciduous or native to non-native. And this little equation up here just describes how community composition and fire regime would affect in turn productivity and carbon flux. So because the effects of something as large as the boreal will have on the atmosphere, it's important to dissect community level productivity into constituent factors. So something that comes up with increased temperatures, it should lead to a direct increase in productivity, so that's actually not a bad thing, but it has to be balanced with everything else to determine the net impact of Canadian forest warming, how that will affect their ability to store carbon. So there's a possibility of a temperature ideality beyond which only certain thermally adaptive species would be able to persist with high productivity. So if it gets too hot, you might actually start losing species and therefore overall productivity. Natural controls on succession, age structure, composition, and sequestration include fire and pests. So that happens outside of human activity. Those are natural things to determine a forest productivity. But anthropogenic forcings on this include exploitation, fragmentation, nuisance species proliferation, and changes to the fire dynamics. Although interestingly, people are really worried about harvesting, like just direct harvesting for timber. In a study of southern Quebec, they found that in the long term, tree mortality, like natural tree mortality in other ways, dwarfs harvesting impacts. So that could be a testament to the size of the amount of forest we harvest, or just the fact that that regeneration of forest, when replanting happens after harvesting, means that other factors are more important to consider for making really long projections. Decomposition also has to be paired with productivity, so higher temperatures might lead to higher productivity, but if that increases decomposition, which it typically does, you might have a net increase in CO2 production. There are landscape and stand level drivers. Studies across Canada have found that there's regional variation in which half of the country responds to an increased driver. So say fire, the West, even though it might be more stressed with fire in the coming years, the East would respond to it more than the West would, because the West has more adapted species to fire regimes. Mutualisms are also interesting to consider, where benefactor and facilitator species coexist, and so you think they'd respond similarly to increased temperature, let's say, but facilitator species are usually more sensitive to climate change than benefactor species, because they're sort of biotically linked to another organism. So if the other organism stopped providing as much nutrients, that would matter far more to them than the temperature increase, because they're pretty inextricably linked to another organism. Metrics of impact of climate change include assessing community structure, total biomass, and then species-specific biomass. As talked about before, an important factor to consider when trying to increase resilience is biodiversity. This can be quantized by species, genus richness, functional diversity, other metrics. Forest ecosystems harbor 80% of terrestrial species, so they're an important source of biodiversity across the world. Luckily for us, many forestry species are undomesticated, demonstrating high natural genotypic diversity, but again, in gymnosperms, that might be harder to assess because of their large genomes, or large repetitive genomes. Natural drivers of plant biodiversity include local site conditions, climate, and stand age. And the gradients that we see across countries or large landscapes might be able to be explained by species energy theory and intermediate disturbance hypothesis. These are two ideas that get at under what conditions will biodiversity be maximized. So I can talk more about them at the end if there's time. Variation in climate sensitivity, you'll have, in a similar way to the facilitator-benefactor difference, canopy species versus understory species respond more or less significantly to overall climate change. And you can view disturbance events as important to biodiversity because they reset the local successional stage. So you might have a climax succession ecosystem, and then it gets hit with something that completely wipes out the large vegetation, and now you have basically the conditions just right for pioneer species to come in, even though nothing climatically has really changed. Facilitation in all of this, like the positive interspecies interactions, might be understudied. We usually approach ecology through an antagonistic model, explaining coexistence through negative species interactions like trophism, but there could be the possibility that maybe things like the sharing of nutrients is far more important than all these negative interactions that we usually use to explain coexistence. So there's some things that come about because of that, like competitive intransitivity, and ways that that might mask facilitation is like the stress gradient hypothesis, which says that its power depends on the degree of stress in the ecosystem. But potentially facilitation could be used as a context-specific driver of biodiversity. So having talked about biodiversity in the general sense, we now move to the urban. It's already been shown that tree species richness has been correlated with stability and productivity in rural forests, so that's our motivation for looking into this in general. half the global population already lives in cities, so we would want to maximize ecosystem services in these environments. Forests along the rural-urban axis can inform our policies of the future because they sort of act as a time stage model if we assume that more land will be relegated to cities in the future. And while cities are challenged with the burden of invasion, they have a lot of dispersal vectors, they could be potential sources of novel ecosystems. So we usually want to preserve native historical ecosystems, but in places that those things aren't entirely endemic, it might be more realistic and more helpful to embrace novel ecosystem assemblages. In a theoretical sense, it's a patchwork landscape. They have plenty of places for theoretical niches. The issue is usually small population sizes or extreme conditions that might limit overall biodiversity. Street trees in particular, although they're only a small minority of the forest, are endowed with specific public functions. We plant them for a reason. So we could use that as a vector for increasing biodiversity. With all that, there's landscape level and human strengths of the urban forest to increase our conservation efforts there. Human resources include like a concentrated financial resources of the city in comparison to the country. In assessing biodiversity, the current situation is not the best, where we have large studies of, at the regional scale, 3 states finding violations of Santomore's rules, diversity indices, metrics, domination of certain plants, and diseases that are wreaking havoc on certain species. Ultimately, this leads to a lot of urban forests being immature as well, which is an issue because they provide fewer niches, as been demonstrated by vertical complexity being associated with biodiversity. So, restoration ecology has been usually relegated to the country, but there's a lot of principles we can apply in conservation efforts in the city, with core ethics valuing biodiversity and not valuing untimely distinction, seeing ecological complexity and evolution as good. We have to balance intrinsic biodiversity and nativity goals when doing restoration ecology. It might necessitate stereotyping the functional traits of dominant forest species, as been shown by functional traits being important. And lastly, in a note that can often limit aesthetic green spaces, is that we could expand visual uniformity and aesthetic paradigms in managed forests to include more complexity. It might look good for a single species to inhabit a park, but that will not lead to a wealth of biodiversity. So research required for effective urban conservation efforts includes assessing functional traits. Provenance trials have been the mainstay in many management areas, but they take a long time. So there are other ways to kind of cut down on that time cost by using genomic data, using environmental niche modeling to just better fit species before you even plant them to your local climate. Sourcing strategies, including co-developing drought tolerance indices to figure out which trees are good for your area. Doing this screening of cultivars before you need to plant them. Production-wise, if there's local production, you can have a better control of what's available. Identifying seed rain is also important, where maybe you don't need to source all of your material. If there's a local forest that's just outside the city limits, but wind carries seeds to your area every once in a while, you can rely on that as a source of regeneration. Planting, there's some alternative techniques to embrace for transplanting and like potting that would increase plant survivability in really dense areas. And ultimately, we're going to talk about this guided succession as the takeaway for today. So because of all the people involved in conservation efforts, it's helpful to use a cooperative management style. So co-developing indices, collaborating on tree inventories, engaging community members who can often feel left out of these plans even though they see the results of them all the time. Developing tree arboretums is a cool way to increase public involvement and also have like an avenue for research. And then guided succession describes the overall mindset of viewing planting as not the end stage in forest management. Seeing important milestones. In one paper they talked about the importance of a 20-year post-planting milestone, where all these things start to happen, where your community is going to rapidly change due to the closure of the canopy, shading out of ground weeds, the stabilization of the low canopy microclimate. This is walking your ecosystem through succession, as opposed to planting and then walking away, maybe checking later. Enrichment plantings are often required to get from mid-succession to late succession species, even if the conditions might be right. Earlier on, they find that this 20-year is a good milestone to start doing that. And then monitoring for canopy gaps throughout this entire process. So if you put in all this work, you watch a place for 30 years, but then if you step away and a gap forms, you're just allowing it to reverse its successional path. So we've got to see succession as a very active maintenance piece. So this is a summary that I'll leave up on the slides for the Q&A. Some future research topics to inspire questions if none arise. Go through my references. I'd like to acknowledge a couple people. So this idea was posed to me with my co-facilitators at the ECOLE project, the Sustainability Hub. And then a couple bodies helped me get here financially. So the ECOLE project and the Student Society of McGill University helped fund this whole thing. I'd like to say thank you to the venue and all you guys for listening. And I'll leave up the summary slide for questions.
So I might jumpstart the question period. So you mentioned that this is kind of theoretical, you put a lot of thought into this, and I'm sure done a lot of research. So I wonder what would be your kind of next practical step in all of this? In an ideal world, what would be kind of the next great, amazing thing that might come of this in application?
Well, I think, I talked about many ecology and evolutionary principles to keep in mind, but that's not very practical for management. I think the most practical result of my study was this concept of guided succession, and it's outlined very well in a paper, find the reference here, in New Zealand. Yeah, this one here. So they just do a good job of telling you how they kind of got these numbers for those milestones that are important, and something that would be helpful for city planners maybe is to get sort of like a timetable to keep in mind. So you start out 10 years before you want to do something. Be like, these are the sourcing things you need to consider to have the ultimate planting options that you want. Then what transplanting and planting options are there at year 0. Then what milestones are important to keep in mind after that. So the 20-year one, but there's also earlier ones for, there's some obligate epiphytes or something like that, things that grow along the trees that won't really naturally arise. You have to plant them after like a 5-year or 10-year mark when conditions are better. So just making like a timetable for people to keep in mind, then they can just check it over the course of 20, 30 years, however long the project takes. That'll be helpful.
Cool. I'll take a look at that paper. Any other questions? No, it's the end of the day.
You mentioned that one of the climate change effects is reduced or increased hybridization. Can you talk a little more about that? Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Maybe you have an example of one species that did have increased hybridization due to climate change?
Sure. So I think it's somewhat divisive in that just like there's an argument to be had about the embracing of novel ecosystems, where you kind of relinquish the idea of keeping the historical assemblage that you had before. You're like, that's not practical, we can't keep it exactly as it was. But this new thing that comes about creates evolution. So hybridization can be viewed, if that hybrid stays genetically isolated, can create a new species, right? So some people view hybridization as an overall net loss in biodiversity because it could lead to 2 species kind of just becoming one. But others see it as just a third axis. It's a new genetic makeup, so that maybe that's valued. I think the example that I had read about was one of the, it might be like the American ash versus the mountain ash. One of them is susceptible to a pest pathogen and then the other is not. And so they were finding that one was starting to move, I think the American ash was starting to move closer to the climate of the mountain ash, whereas they had been a little more separated before. And as a result, they're finding hybrids, which have some genetic marker that indicates they have to have DNA from the mountain ash. And that has not been hit by the pest pathogen as bad. So that's kind of the case I know about, and overall opinions on hybridization as like an evolutionary force.
Could you expand on the, you mentioned biological controls and diseases, and then
100%. So it's most often after disaster events that this happens, but it's always the case that we're finding biology to be the most organic, quickest adapting engineered solution that isn't engineered. So in the case of water control, arguably like no human system responds faster to an injection of flood water than biology, as has been talked about in other talks. And so when you have things like bioswales, but also like literally any vegetation, it can respond to immediate water inundation. And so some species do it way better than others, but if you have a control on either the amount of water moving or the amount per time, so some species are really good at like just slowing water before it hits storm drains and things like that, you can allow human systems to not be overwhelmed. So the same amount of water can go through one area with mangroves and without, and just the addition of some mangroves can slow water down enough so that it won't like flood the sewers, even though it's the same amount of water just spread over a longer time. So because of that, you have less standing water, and standing water is the thing that eventually kills people after a natural disaster. Hurricanes can be terrible, but often hurricanes in the past, arguably just because medicine was worse, but it still happens today where after the hurricane, you'll have increased mortality than during the event. You're like, how did that happen? It's because standing water was allowed to sit around for up to half a year or something, and pests and pathogens just proliferate in there and eventually give humans waterborne diseases.
Right, so this was like a human service aspect.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's not good for, I think ECOLE is waterbound? I don't know. Could be a bonus.
What's your take on invasive species? Like an enemy that we need to take down absolutely, or they could be in certain cases allies, even though they may change our ecosystem?
I think that one depends on, as I've been told, the difference between non-native and invasive species to an ecologist is their ability to control the community assemblage they show up in. And so an invasive not only arrives non-natively, but also weeds out other things that are competing with it. Now, arguably, all non-natives have to compete in a sense, so they also control the proliferation of other populations. But invasives are particularly good at making other similar species not being able to survive. So while you can embrace a novel ecosystem and say, this tree has arrived from somewhere across the world, it's not killing everything around it, but it's still not native, and it makes an overall net loss of space for something that is native. I think if it's not reasonable to return to the state that it was before, maybe the climate shifted. Like if it's a wholly different climate than it was in the past, going backwards is not making for a more stable system. If it's still relatively similar, that might be a tough case. But I think like embracing non-natives is okay. Invasives are tough because they are sort of by human definition killing out other things. So in general, you want to avoid that.
Any more questions? Last chance. All right, please join me in thanking Brian. And just a quick reminder that there are still posters hung up in the main hall. Please go take a look at them because they're great, and I don't know when they're actually presenting on them. It might be all the time. But please take a look at that. There are also exhibits in the main hall. And that's it.